Welcome, everyone, to this deep dive, and we are going to be taking a close look at Edmund Burke. Now, you might be
Mhm.
thinking, okay, Edmund Burke isn't exactly a household name like Plato or Aristotle, but trust me, his ideas about politics and society, they're incredibly influential and still relevant today.
You are absolutely spot on there. He wasn't just some philosopher locked away in an ivory tower. He was out there in the thick of it. Involved in the politics of his time. But don't let that fool you. His works are packed with profound philosophical insights, especially when we start talking about politics, society, even aesthetics.
Yeah, and it really strikes me how much his own life experiences seem to have shaped his philosophical views. We're talking 18th century Ireland, a time marked by, some serious social inequalities. And he saw firsthand the need for improvement, and that really seems to have fueled his thinking.
Absolutely. Burke, you see, he was a firm believer that those with education and power had a responsibility to guide society towards positive change. He wasn't interested in abstract philosophizing that was detached from the realities of the world.
It's interesting because this emphasis on, practical improvement, it kind of echoes the ideas of another prominent Irish thinker of that era, George Berkeley. They were both skeptical of pure abstract reasoning and stressed the importance of understanding things in their full context.
You hit the nail on the head. For both Burke and Berkeley, improvement wasn't some kind of utopian fantasy. It was about working within existing institutions and traditions to make real, tangible progress.
Okay, so we've got this foundation of a drive for improvement that's grounded in the real world. But then we bump into Burke's this deep interest in the power of imagination, which seems like a bit of a shift. His philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas, the sublime and beautiful, explores the human mind's capacity to create complex ideas, particularly those related to aesthetic experiences.
Ah, yes, the inquiry. A really important work if you want to grasp Burke's whole philosophical outlook. His exploration of the sublime and the beautiful, it shows how fascinated he was with our human ability to move beyond just basic sensory perceptions and actually create abstract concepts. And this ties directly into his critique of those oversimplified ideas of natural society, which he takes on in his work, A Vindication of Natural Society.
Now, vindication really threw me for a loop. It's like he's messing with us on purpose.
Yeah.
At first glance, it reads like a strong attack on religion, but then you dig a little deeper
Right.
and there's this subtle dismantling of the idea that a primitive state of nature would be some kind of utopia.
It's satire at its finest. By writing as if he's a deist criticizing religion, Burke cleverly exposes the flaws in trying to apply super-rational and idealistic principles to something as complex as politics. And this is so important because it highlights the huge difference between seeing society as something organic that needs careful nurturing, which is Burke's view, and this idea that a primitive state of nature is the ideal.
For a philosopher like yourself, I bet that satirical approach is just fascinating. He's not hitting you over the head with his arguments, but instead he's leading the reader through a thought experiment to expose the problems with a certain way of thinking.
Exactly. It shows just how deep his philosophical engagement really is. And this sophistication, it also comes through in his theory of language, which I think is one of the most overlooked parts of his work. He challenges the idea that abstract terms like liberty or justice have these fixed universal meanings. Instead, he says they evoke powerful images and emotions, and they shape how we understand the world.
And he was brilliant at connecting these abstract ideas with actual historical events and people, right? Especially in his writing and speeches, he uses history to bring those ideas to life.
Absolutely. For Burke, history wasn't just some collection of facts and dates. It was like a living tapestry of human experience, a source of wisdom and also kind of a warning. Like in his works, an account of the European settlements and an abridgment of English history, for instance. In those texts, he shows how complex social and political development really is, and he pushes back against those simple narratives of progress or decline.
And it's especially striking how he uses historical examples to try and improve the image of Catholicism in England, particularly because at the time there was so much anti-Catholic sentiment. It shows he was willing to challenge accepted narratives and dig into the nuances of history.
Absolutely. And this brings us to the point where Burke the philosopher and Burke the politician meet. His deep understanding of language of history, of the nature of complex ideas, it wasn't just for theoretical discussions. It influenced his actions and arguments during his long career in British Parliament.
So he wasn't just an academic sitting in his office. He was out there dealing with the challenges of governing and trying to put those philosophical principles into practice in the real world of politics.
Exactly. And a great example of that is his approach to the American Revolution, which is a fascinating case study in Burkean thinking. He didn't just pick a side. He grappled with all the nuances of the situation. He recognized that the American colonists had legitimate complaints, but he also wanted to preserve the British Empire. His idea of the British Empire, it's really interesting how it kept changing. He tried to find a balance between Parliament's power and the liberties of those American colonies. Not an easy thing to do.
Sounds like he was walking a tightrope.
Yeah.
And yeah, it really does show how he put his philosophical ideas to work during a real political crisis.
You see, because he understood complex ideas so well, he could come up with solutions that weren't just black and white. It wasn't just forcing the colonies to obey or giving them complete freedom. He saw there was more to it than that.
It seems like his respect for tradition and his awareness of what could go wrong,
Yeah.
those unintended consequences of big changes that really shaped how he dealt with things.
Oh, absolutely. He was worried about the potential downsides of the revolution, even though he understood why the Americans had some legitimate complaints. But this cautious approach, it's totally different from how he reacted to the French Revolution. That was a real turning point for him, both in his life and his thinking.
Yeah, the French Revolution seems to have been a really troubling event for him. With the American Revolution, he saw a chance for reform within a system that already existed. But the French Revolution, with its complete overthrow of the monarchy and the whole social order, that must have seemed like something else entirely, something dangerous and misguided.
The French Revolution really shook him to his core. You can see it in his writing, his tone changes and reflections on the revolution in France. He's not just disagreeing with specific policies. He's going after the core philosophical principles behind the revolution, principles that he thought were totally wrong.
Would you say that he saw the French Revolution as like a betrayal of those principles of slow organic change that he valued so much?
Exactly. Burke believed that those abstract ideas of liberty and equality, if they're not connected to history and practical realities, they could easily lead to tyranny and chaos. That's an important thing for a philosopher like you to think about the possible dangers of idealism that's not kept in check. He wasn't against change itself, but he believed that change, especially drastic change, had to be approached carefully with a deep understanding of what it could lead to and with a firm grounding in tradition.
And this brings us back to his theory of language, doesn't it? Those abstract terms like liberty and equality, he argued they don't have set meanings. They're powerful symbols that can bring up a lot of emotions, and they can be manipulated for political purposes.
Absolutely, and that insight makes his criticism of the French Revolution even stronger. He saw how these abstract ideals were being used to justify violence and upheaval, and he was really worried about the long-term effects. He believed that real freedom wasn't about destroying the existing order, but about carefully balancing rights and responsibilities within society.
So, in a way, he was arguing for a more down-to-earth, historically grounded understanding of these big, important concepts. He wasn't saying the ideals themselves were bad, but he had a problem with how they were being used without any thought for their potential impact.
Yes, and this highlights a big difference between Burke and some of the more radical thinkers of his time. He wasn't saying we should go back to some perfect past, and he wasn't embracing a utopian vision of the future. He was a pragmatist, someone who looked for practical solutions within the systems and traditions that already existed.
And this focus on what's practical, on really understanding how complicated real-world situations are, and finding solutions that work within those limits, that's something that I think still matters today. We're still dealing with these questions about balancing individual freedom with social order, the role of government, the dangers of extremism.
Absolutely. Burke's ideas about human nature, the power of language, the importance of history, they're all incredibly relevant in the 21st century. In a world where everything is sound bites and oversimplified ideologies, his emphasis on thinking things through carefully and not rushing into change, it's a valuable perspective.
I'm really interested in how much he emphasized how everything's connected. He seemed to understand that if you change one part of society, it can have unexpected consequences in other areas. Was that a common idea in his work?
Yes, this idea of interconnectedness, it pops up again and again in Burke's writing. He got it. He understood that societies are complicated systems, and if you mess with one part of the system, it can have ripple effects everywhere. That's why he was so careful about radical change, because he knew it could lead to unintended consequences that spread far and wide and could be hard to undo.
It sounds like a really systemic way of looking at things, almost ecological, in the way it recognizes that delicate balance within a complex web of relationships.
Right.
And that perspective seems particularly relevant now, given how interconnected our globalized world is.
Absolutely. Burke's work can help us think about issues like climate change, economic inequality, political polarization. He reminds us that we need to think about the big picture, consider the long-term consequences of what we do, and recognize how things that seem separate are actually connected.
So it's not just about abstract principles or utopian dreams. It's about getting how complicated the world really is and finding solutions that work within those realities.
Exactly. Burke was really skeptical of big schemes and one-size-fits-all solutions. He believed that real progress came from taking things slowly, step by step, in a way that acknowledges how complex human nature is and how limited our knowledge really is.
I imagine this practical approach probably made him some enemies, especially among those who were pushing for more radical change.
Oh, you're absolutely right. People often accused Burke of being too cautious, too stuck in the past, too resistant to progress. But I think they missed the point. He wasn't opposed to change. He just didn't like reckless change, change that's driven by ideology instead of a deep understanding of the situation.
So for a philosopher like yourself, what's the most compelling thing about Burke's work? What sets him apart from other thinkers of his time?
For me, it's his ability to connect theory and practice. He was a brilliant thinker and a man of action, and you see both of those in his work. It's this unique combination of philosophical depth and real-world engagement. He wasn't happy just thinking about the ideal society. He wanted to figure out how to make existing societies better, how to solve the problems that real people were facing.
And it's that commitment to actually solving problems that I think makes him so interesting, especially for a philosopher like you. He wasn't just coming up with ideas. He was dealing with the complexities of politics, society, the whole human condition.
Absolutely. And it's not just his political writings that offer those insights. Even his work on aesthetics, like The Inquiry, shows how well he understood human psychology and the power of ideas.
I've got to admit, for a long time, I thought those aesthetic theories were a little too, fluffy for me as a philosopher. But looking at Burke's work has really made me see how those ideas connect to bigger philosophical questions about knowledge, experience, even morality.
That's what's so great about Burke. He brings together all these different areas of thought aesthetics, politics, history, language. It's like this rich and complex tapestry, and it all comes back to trying to understand the human condition with all its messiness and its greatness.
And speaking of messy, we can't forget about his theory of language, which is a philosophical masterpiece all on its own. He makes us think really hard about how words work, how they shape what we see, how they can be used to tell the truth, and also to hide it.
Yeah, you're right. That's a key part of his thinking. He knew that language isn't just a neutral tool for giving information. It's something that can move people, inspire them, get them fired up. And for someone like Burke, who was so involved in politics, understanding how language works was crucial.
It makes me think about how we often just assume that words have these fixed meanings. But Burke shows us it's not that simple. The meaning of a word can change depending on who's saying it, what they're trying to do, what the audience already thinks. It's almost like a game, right?
A game with some seriously high stakes, especially when you're talking about politics. Burke saw how easily people could use language to twist the truth, to stir up strong emotions, to justify almost anything. And I think that's even more relevant now with social media and all the political spin going on.
It's like he's giving us a set of tools for critical thinking, a way to take apart the words we hear every day and see through all the tricks. And that brings us back to that last point about the French Revolution. It seems like part of his criticism was about how people were using language to justify ideas that were radical and, in his view, dangerous.
That's exactly it. He saw how those abstract terms like liberty and equality, if you take them out of context, if you don't think about the practical side of things, they can become dangerous tools for people who want to manipulate others. And his reflections, it's like a passionate argument for a more grounded, more historically informed way of understanding those concepts.
So it's not that he was against liberty or equality. It's
Yeah.
just that he understood how those ideals could be twisted and used to justify things that might actually end up making things worse.
Exactly. And here's a key takeaway for anyone who loves philosophy and is diving into Burke. He challenges us to think beyond simple either arguments, to embrace nuance and complexity, to understand that even the best ideas can be misused and lead to bad outcomes if we're not careful.
It reminds us that philosophy isn't just about thinking up theories. It's about understanding the world as it is with all its complexities and finding ways to deal with its challenges wisely and carefully. And Burke, even though he doesn't fit neatly into any one philosophical category, offers a lot of insights for anyone who wants to grapple with these really big questions.
He pushes us to really think about the connection between what we think and what we do, the power of language, the importance of knowing history, and the fact that human reason has its limits. And in a world that often seems to value simple answers over complex ones, his work is like a breath of fresh air.
So as we finish up this deep dive into Edmund Burke, I think the big challenge he gives us, especially you as a fellow philosopher, is this: don't be afraid of complexity. Embrace it. Get in there and wrestle with it. Because it's in those messy, complicated areas that we often find the most important truths about ourselves and the world around us.